In the quiet mountains of Colorado, 12-year-old Tommy Brennan thought he knew every trail and hidden spot near his family's cabin. But when he discovers what appears to be an abandoned campsite deep in the woods, he realizes some secrets are buried for good reason. The camp isn't empty. It's a cartel operation filled with weapons, drug money, and evidence of something much darker. When Tommy tries to flee, he hears voices approaching through the trees. The cartel has returned, and they can't afford witnesses. What started as an innocent adventure becomes a desperate fight for survival, as Tommy must use everything his grandfather taught him about the wilderness to stay alive. But will a 12-year-old boy's knowledge of these mountains be enough to outsmart ruthless criminals who will stop at nothing to protect their operation? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the pine needles, casting dancing shadows across the wooden deck where Tommy Brennan sat cross-legged, carefully studying his hand-drawn trail map. Every line, every marker, every warning note had been meticulously placed over 3 summers of exploration. The yellowed paper, now soft from countless foldings, showed a network of paths that snaked through the Colorado wilderness like veins through a living body. You're planning another adventure, aren't you? Grandfather Frank's voice carried the warmth of someone who understood the call of the mountains. At 72, Frank Brennan still moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent 40 years as a park ranger. Reading the wilderness like others read newspapers, Tommy looked up from his map, his brown eyes bright with the restless energy that had defined him since he could walk. Just thinking about the northeast section. There's this area I've never explored. He pointed to a blank space on his map, bordered by his careful notations of known trails. Frank settled into the wooden chair beside him, his weathered hands cradling a steaming cup of coffee. The smell mixed with the mountain air, creating that particular scent Tommy associated with home. The blank spaces are always the most tempting, aren't they? But sometimes they're blank for good reason. You always say that, Tommy said, but without irritation. His grandfather's cautious wisdom had kept him safe through countless expeditions into terrain that would challenge experienced hikers. Because it's always true, Frank reached over and tapped the compass that hung from Tommy's neck, a brass instrument that had belonged to Frank's own father. What does this teach us? Tommy recited the familiar lesson. Always know where you are, always know where you're going, and always have a way back. And never venture beyond your ability to return safely. Frank nodded, satisfied. Your grandmother and I won't be around forever, Tommy. These mountains will test you in ways you can't imagine yet. The skills I'm teaching you aren't just for fun weekend hikes. Tommy had heard variations of this conversation before, but lately there seemed to be more weight behind his grandfather's words. Maybe it was because his parents had been working longer hours in Denver, leaving him here for extended stays. Maybe it was because he was getting older, becoming more aware of the responsibility that came with wilderness knowledge. The screen door creaked open, and Grandmother Helen appeared with a plate of fresh blueberry pancakes. At 68, she moved with the practical efficiency of someone who had raised 4 children and countless grandchildren in these mountains. Planning another expedition, are we? Just looking, Tommy said, accepting the plate gratefully. Helen's pancakes were legendary in their family. Made with wild blueberries she gathered from secret spots Frank had shown her decades ago. Looking leads to wondering, wondering leads to exploring, and exploring, Helen smiled. Well, that's how we ended up with this one in the first place. She ruffled Tommy's dark hair affectionately. Frank and Helen had met on a mountain rescue operation 35 years ago. She'd been a volunteer EMT. He'd been the ranger coordinating the search. They'd found the lost hiker, saved his life, and somewhere between the emergency radio calls and the careful descent down rocky terrain, they'd found each other. The thing about maps, Frank continued, settling back into the morning rhythm of coffee and conversation that Tommy treasured, is that they show you what other people have discovered, but they can't show you what you're not ready to handle. Tommy studied his grandfather's face, noting the network of lines that spoke of decades spent in sun and wind. Frank had stories about every trail, every peak, every dangerous crossing within 50 miles. Some were funny, some were educational, and some Frank only told when he thought Tommy was mature enough to understand the real lessons hidden within them. "I've been thinking about that area past Copper Ridge," Tommy said carefully, watching his grandfather's reaction. "The one where the old mining roads are supposed to be." Frank's expression shifted slightly, the way it always did when Tommy mentioned areas that weren't clearly marked on official trail maps. "That's rough country, Tommy. Steep terrain, unstable ground from old mining operations. And it's not well-traveled, which means if something goes wrong, no one would find me for days," Tommy finished. It was another of Frank's cardinal rules: never go where you can't be found. Helen sat down with her own coffee, joining the familiar debate about boundaries and exploration that seemed to define Tommy's relationship with these mountains. "Your grandfather isn't trying to keep you from adventure, sweetheart. He's trying to make sure you live long enough to have many more of them." Tommy nodded, understanding the logic, even as his eyes drifted back to the blank spaces on his map. There was something magnetic about the unknown, something that called to him with a voice he was only just beginning to recognize as the same restlessness that had drawn both his grandfather and his parents. To lives defined by challenge and discovery. 3 days later, Tommy found himself standing at the edge of what his grandfather would call a decision point. The official trail ended here, marked by a weathered wooden post that had seen better decades. Beyond it, an unmarked path wound upward through dense aspen groves, disappearing into shadows that seemed to promise either adventure or trouble. The broken "No Trespassing" sign lay half buried in fallen leaves, its message fragmented but still readable. Someone had torn it down, or maybe winter storms had finally claimed it after years of mountain weather. Either way, it no longer stood as the clear barrier it once had been. Tommy adjusted his backpack and checked his grandfather's compass. The needle pointed steadily north, just as it always had. But somehow it felt different today. Heavier, like it was trying to tell him something beyond simple direction. His internal argument had been raging since breakfast. Grandfather Frank's voice echoed in his memory, reminding him about boundaries and safety, about the difference between calculated risk and reckless endangerment. But there was another voice, too, one that sounded suspiciously like his own growing restlessness, whispering about discovery and the kind of stories that only came from crossing into unmapped territory. The morning air carried the crisp bite of early autumn. In a few weeks, these mountains would be locked in snow, making exploration impossible until spring. This might be his last chance to satisfy the curiosity that had been gnawing at him all summer. Tommy stepped over the fallen sign. The trail immediately felt different from the maintained paths he knew so well. Where official trails were carefully graded and cleared, this one demanded attention to every step. Roots reached across the path like gnarled fingers, and loose rocks shifted underfoot with each movement. It was the kind of terrain that punished carelessness and rewarded patience. As he climbed higher, the familiar sounds of the lower mountains began to fade. No more distant highway noise, no more aircraft passing overhead, no more hikers calling to each other on parallel trails. The silence grew deeper with each step, until all he could hear was his own breathing and the whisper of wind through pine needles. The trees here were older, thicker, with bark scarred by decades of storms and seasons. They stood like silent witnesses to whatever secrets this part of the mountain held. Tommy found himself moving more quietly, though he couldn't say exactly why. Something about this place demanded respect, or maybe caution. An hour into the unmarked trail, he encountered his first real obstacle. A massive deadfall had created a natural barrier across the path, forcing him to choose between turning back and finding a way around. The fallen tree was ancient, its trunk thick enough that he couldn't see over it even on his tiptoes. Tommy worked his way around the deadfall, using skills his grandfather had taught him about reading terrain and finding safe passage. The detour took him through underbrush that hadn't seen human passage in years, maybe decades. Branches caught at his jacket, and more than once he had to stop and carefully extract himself from tangles of mountain brush. When he finally regained the trail on the far side of the obstacle, he noticed something that made him pause. The path here was different, not just overgrown but somehow wrong. The rocks were arranged in patterns that didn't look natural, and the cleared space was wider than made sense for a simple hiking trail. His grandfather had taught him to read the signs that previous travelers left behind. Broken branches at specific heights indicated pack animals. Worn stones showed where people had repeatedly stepped. Fire rings marked regular camping spots. But this trail showed signs he didn't recognize, markers that spoke of purpose he couldn't identify. The smart thing would be to turn back. Tommy knew that, could hear Frank's voice as clearly as if his grandfather were standing beside him. This was exactly the kind of situation Frank had warned him about. The moment when curiosity crossed the line into danger. But as he stood there, weighing wisdom against wonder, Tommy realized something had shifted inside him. The little boy who had always accepted his grandfather's boundaries without question was growing into someone who needed to test those boundaries for himself. It wasn't rebellion exactly. It was growth. He checked his compass again, noted his position relative to familiar landmarks, and made sure he could retrace his steps. Then he continued up the unmarked trail, each step carrying him further from the safety of known territory, and deeper into whatever waited in the blank spaces of his carefully drawn map. The path wound higher, switchbacking through terrain that grew increasingly wild and untouched. Tommy began to understand why this area had been left unmarked. It wasn't just difficult. It was remote in a way that made you feel truly alone in the world. And sometimes he was beginning to learn. Being alone in the world meant discovering things that were better left undiscovered. The smell hit him first. Tommy paused on the narrow trail, his nose wrinkling at an odor that didn't belong in the clean mountain air. It was sharp, chemical, mixed with something organic and unpleasant, like cleaning supplies left too long in the sun, or fuel that had spilled and soaked into earth. He almost turned back then. Every instinct his grandfather had carefully cultivated over 3 summers of wilderness training told him that unusual smells meant potential danger. But curiosity, that relentless force that had driven him this far from safe territory, pushed him forward another 100 yards. That's when he saw the camouflage netting. At first glance it looked natural. Someone had done an expert job of weaving the artificial material with real branches and pine boughs, creating a canopy that blended seamlessly with the surrounding forest. Tommy might have walked right past it if a corner hadn't come loose, fluttering just enough to catch his eye. Beneath the netting, he could make out the edges of what appeared to be a campsite. Relief flooded through him. After 2 hours of climbing through increasingly isolated terrain, the prospect of encountering other people, even strangers, felt reassuring. Maybe they were researchers or surveyors or just experienced backpackers who knew about this remote area. Tommy approached the edge of the concealed camp, preparing to call out a greeting. Then he stopped. Something was wrong. The camp was too organized, too permanent for casual backpackers. Canvas structures were arranged in precise patterns, connected by paths that had been deliberately cleared and maintained. Equipment was stacked under additional tops, creating supply depots that spoke of long-term occupation rather than temporary visits, and there were no people. Tommy crept closer, his grandfather's lessons about observation kicking in automatically. Look before you commit. Assess before you approach. Always have an exit strategy. The first thing he noticed was the generator. It was military grade, far too sophisticated for normal camping. Thick cables ran from it to various points throughout the camp, providing power for equipment that remained hidden under additional camouflage. The second thing he noticed was the weapons. They were stacked against trees like casual camping gear, but Tommy recognized them from movies and video games. Assault rifles, handguns, and things he couldn't identify, but that looked serious and expensive. This wasn't hunting equipment. This was combat gear. His hands began to shake. The third thing he noticed was the plastic-wrapped bundles stacked under a lean-to shelter. White bricks, each one marked with symbols he didn't understand, but that his 12-year-old brain somehow recognized as dangerous. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, arranged with the careful precision of inventory. Tommy's breath came in short, shallow gasps. This wasn't a campsite. This was something else entirely, something that made his grandfather's warnings about dangerous territory seem prophetic. He needed to leave, now. But as he started to back away, his foot caught on something half buried in the pine needles. Looking down, he saw the corner of a plastic tarp, dirt-stained and partially concealed. Something was buried underneath it, something large enough to require a deliberate hiding place. Every rational thought told him to run. But there was something about the careful concealment, the deliberate burial, that suggested secrets worth keeping. And 12-year-old curiosity, even terrified curiosity, has a power all its own. Tommy knelt and carefully pulled back a corner of the tarp. The smell that escaped made him gag and stumble backward. It was the organic component of the odor he'd noticed earlier, now concentrated and unmistakable. Decay, death. Something that had been buried not to preserve it, but to hide it. He saw enough in that brief glimpse to understand that this place was far more dangerous than anything his grandfather had ever warned him about. This wasn't just criminal. This was evil. Tommy ran. He crashed through the underbrush surrounding the camp, no longer caring about stealth or leaving traces. His only thought was distance, getting as far away as possible from whatever he had stumbled into. Branches tore at his clothes and scratched his face, but he barely noticed. Behind him, the camouflaged camp sat in silence, keeping its secrets. But Tommy knew those secrets now, or at least enough of them to understand that he had crossed a line from which there might be no safe return. His grandfather's compass bounced against his chest as he ran, its steady needle pointing toward home, toward safety, toward a world where the worst dangers were steep trails and sudden weather changes. But Tommy was no longer in that world. He was in a place where innocence had no protection, and where the blank spaces on maps sometimes stayed blank for very good reasons. Tommy made it 50 yards before his legs gave out. He collapsed. Behind a massive boulder, his chest heaving, his mind reeling from what he had glimpsed under that tarp. Every instinct screamed at him to keep running, to put as much distance as possible between himself and that hidden camp. But his body had reached its limit, and his brain was struggling to process what he had seen. The image burned in his memory. The shape under the plastic, the smell, the way the earth had been disturbed and then carefully concealed. His 12-year-old mind didn't want to accept what his eyes had shown him. But the truth was there, unavoidable and terrifying. Someone had died in that camp. Someone had been killed and buried like garbage. Tommy pressed his back against the cold granite, trying to steady his breathing. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory, calm and measured. In crisis situations, the first thing you do is stop and think. Panic kills more people in the wilderness than bears, weather, and falls combined. Stop and think. Tommy forced himself to follow the advice, though every fiber of his being wanted to flee down the mountain as fast as his legs could carry him. What had he actually seen? A camp with weapons, drugs, and evidence of violence. People who would do anything to keep their secrets hidden. A location so remote that screams wouldn't carry to the nearest trail, let alone to help. And now he was a witness. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't just a kid who had wandered into the wrong place at the wrong time. He was evidence. He was a threat to whatever operation was running out of that concealed camp. And threats, based on what he had found buried there, were dealt with permanently. Tommy's hands shook as he reached for his backpack. Inside, along with his water and emergency supplies, was something his grandfather had insisted he always carry. A small, digital camera. Document everything interesting, Frank had told him. The mountains have stories, and someday you might want to remember the details. The camera felt impossibly heavy in his hands. Taking pictures would mean going back. It would mean approaching that camp again, risking discovery, putting himself in even greater danger. But it would also mean having proof. Tommy thought about his grandfather, about the careful way Frank had taught him to read signs in the wilderness. Frank had been more than just a park ranger. The stories he told, the skills he demonstrated, the way he moved through dangerous terrain, all suggested experience that went beyond hiking trails and camping permits. What would Frank do in this situation? The answer came to him with uncomfortable clarity. Frank would gather intelligence. He would document the threat and find a way to neutralize it safely. He wouldn't run blindly down the mountain and hope the problem would disappear. Tommy checked his camera battery and made sure the memory card had space. Then he began the careful journey back toward the camp, moving with all the stealth his grandfather had taught him over countless hours of wildlife observation. The chemical smell grew stronger as he approached the camouflaged perimeter. Tommy found a position behind a fallen log that gave him a clear view of the camp while keeping him hidden in deep shadow. From here he could see details that had escaped him during his panicked first encounter. The operation was larger than he had initially realized. What he had thought was one camp was actually several connected areas, each serving a different purpose. The weapons cache was just one component. There were also communication stations, supply depots, and what looked like a vehicle maintenance area. Tommy began taking pictures, being careful to capture everything from multiple angles. The weapons, the drugs, the sophisticated equipment, the careful camouflage. But when he came to the area where he had discovered the buried tarp, his hands began shaking again. The blood-stained shovel leaning against a nearby tree told the story more clearly than anything he had found under the plastic. The blade was stained dark, and the handle showed signs of recent use. This wasn't an old crime scene. This was an active one. As Tommy photographed the shovel, a new sound reached his ears, distant but growing closer. The rumble of engines working their way up mountain roads that didn't appear on any official map. Someone was coming back to the camp. Tommy's blood turned to ice water. His careful documentation had taken longer than planned, and now he was trapped in the observation position with no clear escape route. The approaching vehicles would reach the camp in minutes, and when they did, Tommy would be caught in the open with a camera full of evidence that would sign his death warrant. He had one chance. The communication equipment he had photographed included radio gear sophisticated enough to reach the outside world. If he could get to it, if he could send a message before the camp's operators returned, he might be able to call for help. But it would mean moving closer to the camp, not away from it. It would mean betting his life on his ability to operate. Equipment he didn't understand and escape. Before trained killers discovered his presence, the vehicles arrived with the mechanical precision of a military operation. Tommy crouched behind his fallen log, watching 3 black SUVs navigate the hidden road that he now realized had been carved specifically to service this remote camp. The drivers knew exactly where they were going, following a route that had been planned and practiced until it became routine. The first vehicle stopped at what Tommy now recognized as a checkpoint. A man emerged, swept the area with practiced eyes, then signaled the all-clear to the convoy behind him. These weren't casual criminals. They moved with the discipline of soldiers or professionals who had learned that carelessness meant death. Tommy pressed himself deeper into the shadows as more men exited the vehicles. He counted 8, all carrying weapons, all scanning their surroundings with the alertness of people who expected trouble. Their conversation carried across the still mountain air, spoken in rapid Spanish that Tommy couldn't understand but recognized as urgent and focused. Then one of them pulled out a 2-way radio, and Tommy's world collapsed. The voice that crackled through the device was speaking English. clear and cold. Base to Mobile 1. Report status on the perimeter breach. Mobile 1 to base. Confirming signs of intrusion in Sector 7. Footprints, disturbed vegetation, possible observation post behind the equipment cache. Tommy's blood froze. They knew someone had been here. They knew someone had seen what shouldn't be seen. Copy that, Mobile 1. Initiate search protocol. Subject is likely local. Probably a hiker who wandered off established trails. We need clean containment before sunset. Clean containment. The phrase sent ice through Tommy's veins. He didn't need translation to understand what that meant. The leader of the group, a man with grey hair and scars that spoke of violence as a profession, began issuing orders in both Spanish and English. Teams spread out in coordinated patterns, each taking responsibility for specific search sectors. They had done this before. Tommy watched them work and realized with growing horror that his grandfather's lessons about wilderness survival had never covered scenarios like this. Frank had taught him about bears, storms, and getting lost. He had never taught him about trained killers with radios and systematic search patterns. Mobile 2, take the north perimeter. Mobile 3, work south along the ridgeline. I want overlapping coverage and constant communication. Whatever came through here left evidence, and evidence can tell us where it went. The radio crackled again, this time with a different voice. Base, this is Overwatch. We've got drone assets available if you need aerial reconnaissance. Drones. Tommy's heart hammered against his ribs. They had drones. Negative on the drone for now, the leader responded. Too much risk of outside observation. But keep them on standby. If our ground search doesn't produce results in the next hour, we'll escalate. Tommy understood that he was listening to his own death sentence being planned with the calm efficiency of a business meeting. These people killed for a living, and they were discussing his elimination the same way his grandfather might plan a hiking route. But something else was happening on the radio, something that made Tommy's situation infinitely worse. Base to Mobile 1, we've got updated intelligence. Local park service reported a missing juvenile this morning. 12-year-old male, experienced hiker, last seen heading toward the northwest sector. Grandfather called it in when the kid didn't return for evening check-in. Tommy's knees nearly buckled. His grandfather knew he was missing. Frank would be organizing search parties, calling in favors from other rangers, mobilizing resources to find him, which meant that Tommy's disappearance was now an official matter, with people asking questions and looking in places where questions weren't welcome. Understood, Base. That complicates our timeline. How do you want to handle the wider search effort? We're monitoring all emergency frequencies. So far, the official search is concentrated on established trails in the opposite direction, but that won't last. We need resolution before they expand the search grid. The leader looked at his watch, then at his teams, spreading through the forest. New timeline, people. We've got maybe 4 hours before this becomes a much bigger problem. Find the kid, clean up the situation, and prepare for immediate relocation of base operations. Tommy realized with crystalline clarity that he wasn't just running for his own life anymore. His grandfather's search efforts, meant to save him, had actually made the situation deadlier for everyone involved. If Frank led other searchers into this area, they would all disappear. The radio crackled one more time. Mobile units, be advised. Subject is likely carrying standard hiking gear, including emergency whistle and possibly communication devices. Monitor all frequencies and be prepared for attempts to signal for help. They knew about emergency procedures. They knew about distress signals. They had thought of everything, except one crucial detail. They didn't know that Tommy's grandfather had taught him how to become invisible in terrain like this. Tommy's escape from the observation position should have been perfect. He had waited for the search teams to spread out, identified a gap in their coverage pattern, and moved with all the stealth his grandfather had taught him during countless wildlife tracking expeditions. Every step was calculated, every movement deliberate, every breath controlled. He made it 200 yards before he realized his fatal mistake. His water bottle was gone. Tommy's hand went to the side pocket of his backpack, where he always kept his blue aluminum water bottle, the one with his name etched into the metal that his grandmother had given him for his 12th birthday. The pocket was empty. Somewhere between his panicked retreat and his careful return for photographs, he had lost the one piece of evidence that would lead his hunters directly to him. Behind him, voices carried through the trees. They had found it. Mobile 1 to base. We've got positive identification. Blue water bottle. Personalized engraving reads, Tommy Brennan. Subject is confirmed as the missing juvenile. Tommy pressed himself against a massive pine tree, his mind racing through implications. They knew his name now. They could connect him to his grandfather, to his family, to everyone he cared about. This wasn't just about silencing a random witness anymore. This was about eliminating a specific threat with specific connections to specific people. Copy that, Mobile 1. Initiate full tracking protocol. I want bloodhounds if we can get them, thermal imaging if we can't, and get me everything you can find on the Brennan family. I want to know who we're dealing with. The radio chatter continued, but Tommy was no longer listening. He was moving, using every technique Frank had taught him about covering ground quickly while leaving minimal traces. His grandfather's lessons had covered pursuit scenarios, though always in the context of avoiding bears or getting found during search and rescue operations. The principles were the same, but the stakes were infinitely higher. Stay off ridgelines where you're silhouetted against the sky. Avoid disturbing vegetation at eye level where broken branches are easily spotted. Step on rocks when possible, soft earth when necessary, never on anything that will hold a clear print. Move with purpose, but never with panic. Tommy implemented each lesson while his mind worked through the larger problem. His hunters were professionals with radio communication and systematic search methods. They knew the terrain well enough to maintain a base operation here. And now they had physical evidence connecting him to a family that lived in a known location, with established routines. His grandfather would be leading the official search effort, probably coordinating with other park rangers and local law enforcement. Frank knew these mountains better than anyone, which meant he would eventually expand the search into areas that weren't on tourist maps. Areas like this one. Tommy needed to warn him without leading the cartel directly to the search teams. But first, he needed to survive the next few hours. The terrain ahead offered both opportunities and challenges. A creek ran through the valley, providing water and the possibility of masking his scent trail. But it also channeled his movement into predictable patterns. The ridgelines offered better escape routes, but exposed him to observation from multiple directions. Tommy chose the creek, betting that his knowledge of the specific landscape would overcome the tactical disadvantage. This was still his territory, even if it had been invaded by people who knew how to hunt humans. The water was cold enough to numb his feet through his hiking boots, but it would also eliminate scent trails and footprints. Tommy moved upstream, staying in the rocky shallows where possible, using fallen logs and overhanging vegetation for concealment when the banks offered no cover. Behind him, the search was intensifying. He could hear vehicles moving to new positions, teams being repositioned to cover different sectors. The radio chatter was constant now. Professional voices coordinating a manhunt with military efficiency. But there was something else in the sounds reaching him from the camp. Urgency, maybe even concern. Base to all mobile units. Be advised, we've got official search aircraft inbound to adjacent sectors. Timeline is now critical. We need resolution in the next 2 hours, or we scrub the entire operation. Tommy smiled grimly as he worked his way upstream. His grandfather wasn't just leading a ground search. Frank was pulling every resource available, pressuring the system until help arrived from multiple directions. The old park ranger understood that time was the most important factor in wilderness rescue, and he was applying that knowledge to save his grandson. The cartel was discovering that hunting a local kid in his own backyard was more complicated than they had anticipated. Every minute Tommy stayed free was another minute for official search efforts to expand. Another minute for questions to be asked in places where questions were dangerous. But Tommy also understood that cornered predators were at their most dangerous. As their window of opportunity closed, they would take greater risks, accept higher levels of collateral damage, and make decisions that prioritized immediate survival over long-term security. The creek led Tommy deeper into terrain that most hikers never saw, a network of ravines and hidden valleys that existed in the spaces between official trail maps. Here, his grandfather's teachings transformed from academic knowledge into life-saving skills. Frank's survival knife hung from Tommy's belt, a tool he had carried on every wilderness expedition, but never needed for anything more serious than cutting rope or preparing kindling. Now it represented his primary means of protection against threats that bore no resemblance to the natural dangers Frank had prepared him for. Tommy paused beside a beaver dam, using the engineered maze of logs and mud as both cover and observation post. His pursuers were good, but they were operating in his environment now, following rules he'd been learning since he could walk. The first tactical error came within 20 minutes. 2 searchers approached the creek from downstream, moving with the confident stride of people who assumed their quarry was fleeing in panic. They were talking, their voices carrying easily across the water, discussing search patterns and timeline pressures with the casual certainty of professionals who had done this before. Tommy watched them through gaps in the beaver dam, noting their equipment, their positioning, their communication habits. They carried military-grade radios, wore tactical gear suitable for mountain operations, and moved with the disciplined coordination of people who had trained together extensively, but they didn't know about the beaver dam. Tommy had discovered this particular engineering marvel 2 summers ago, when a family of beavers had decided to redirect the creek through a series of channels that created a natural maze. The structure was invisible from most angles, hidden by willows and marsh grass that made it look like ordinary wetland. The lead searcher stepped confidently onto what appeared to be solid ground and immediately sank knee-deep into beaver-engineered mud that had the consistency of concrete. His partner moved to help and found himself similarly trapped, both men struggling against suction that turned every movement into exhausting effort. Their radio chatter shifted from confident coordination to frustrated problem-solving as they worked to extract themselves from the natural trap. Tommy used their distraction to move further upstream, gaining precious distance while his hunters dealt with an obstacle that hadn't appeared in their tactical planning. But the encounter taught him something important. These men were professionals, but they were operating outside their normal environment. They expected pursuit scenarios involving urban terrain, rural roads, and environments where human engineering provided predictable advantages. They weren't prepared for landscape that followed rules older than civilization. Tommy's grandfather had taught him to think like the animals he tracked. Deer didn't follow human logic when evading predators. They used terrain, instinct, and intimate knowledge of their environment to survive against threats that were faster, stronger, and better armed. The creek eventually led to a series of granite pools, each one carved by centuries of spring runoff into shapes that provided natural concealment. Tommy had discovered them during his first summer with Frank, when they had spent an entire afternoon watching a family of otters teach their young to fish in the crystal-clear water. Now the pools offered something more valuable than wildlife observation. They offered tactical advantage. Tommy positioned himself in the largest pool, using an underwater ledge to remain hidden while maintaining visual contact with his back trail. The granite walls created natural sound amplification, allowing him to hear approaching footsteps long before visual contact became possible. He didn't have to wait long. The search team had regrouped and adjusted their approach, moving more carefully now that they understood the terrain held surprises. But their radio discipline had suffered. Frustration was creeping into their communications, and Tommy could hear the growing tension between field operatives and command authority. Mobile 3 to base. Subject is using terrain knowledge to maximum advantage. Recommend bringing in local tracking assets. Negative Mobile 3. We cannot risk outside contractors at this time. Adapt your search methods and maintain operational security. Tommy smiled grimly. His hunters were discovering the difference between knowing how to track and knowing what to track in specific terrain. They had the skills, but he had the knowledge. And in wilderness survival, knowledge of local conditions could overcome superior equipment and training. The lead searcher appeared at the edge of the granite pools, moving more cautiously now, but still following predictable patterns. He checked obvious hiding places, scanned for footprints on soft ground, and maintained radio contact with his partner, who was working the opposite bank. What he didn't do was look underwater. Tommy remained motionless on his underwater ledge, breathing through a hollow reed he had prepared while waiting for pursuit to arrive. It was a technique Frank had shown him for wildlife photography, a way to remain hidden while observing sensitive animal behavior. The searcher spent 10 minutes examining the pools, even kneeling beside the one where Tommy was concealed. But military training hadn't prepared him for the possibility that his 12-year-old target might be breathing through improvised equipment. 3 feet below the surface, the emergency whistle had been Tommy's grandfather's idea, though he had never explained it quite the way Tommy was beginning to understand it now. "It's not just for calling help," Frank had told him during one of their early wilderness training sessions. "It's for communication. 3 short blasts mean I'm okay, but need assistance. 1 long blast means emergency, send help immediately. But the most important signal is 2 short, 1 long, repeated 3 times. That means I'm in extreme danger, but cannot reveal my position." Tommy fingered the whistle hanging from his neck, remembering that conversation with new clarity. His grandfather hadn't been teaching him standard hiking safety protocols. He had been teaching him tactical communication for scenarios that went far beyond getting lost on mountain trails. The realization crystallized other memories, small details that had seemed like excessive caution at the time, but now felt like pieces of a larger picture. Frank's insistence on memorizing emergency frequencies, his emphasis on concealment techniques that went beyond simple wildlife observation, his knowledge of terrain features that didn't appear on civilian maps. Tommy's grandfather had been preparing him for exactly this kind of situation. The granite pools had provided temporary sanctuary, but Tommy knew his hunters would eventually expand their search patterns to include areas they had initially dismissed. He needed to move, and he needed to do it in a way that would give him sustainable advantage rather than temporary reprieve. Frank's voice echoed in his memory. "In extended survival situations, your mind is your most important tool. Physical skills will keep you alive in the short term, but strategic thinking determines whether you survive long enough for rescue to find you." Strategic thinking. Tommy forced himself to analyze his situation with the same methodical approach his grandfather had taught him for planning extended wilderness expeditions. Assets. Intimate knowledge of local terrain. Basic survival equipment. Photographic evidence of criminal activity. Ongoing official search effort led by experienced professionals. Liabilities. Outnumbered by trained killers. Limited food and water. No direct communication with rescue forces. Family members potentially at risk if his location became known. Objectives. Survive long enough for rescue. Warn authorities about cartel operation. Protect family from retaliation. The strategic framework helped calm his mind and focus his thinking. This wasn't just about running anymore. It was about creating conditions that would lead to successful resolution of a complex tactical problem. Tommy remembered another of Frank's lessons, delivered during a winter survival exercise when hypothermia had been a real threat. When you're outmatched in terms of strength or equipment, you change the nature of the conflict. You don't fight on their terms. You create new terms that favor your strengths. His strengths were knowledge and mobility. Their strengths were coordination and firepower. The solution was to create scenarios where knowledge and mobility mattered more than coordination and firepower. Tommy began moving again, but this time with purpose that went beyond simple evasion. He was leading his hunters into terrain that would challenge their operational assumptions and stretch their resources beyond sustainable limits. The route he chose wound through a series of connected ravines that created natural choke points and observation positions. Anyone following this path would be forced into predictable movements through areas where Tommy could observe without being observed. More importantly, the ravines led toward the border of official Park Service territory, where his grandfather's search efforts would eventually expand. If Tommy could maintain his lead long enough, he could guide this confrontation into areas where help was more likely to arrive. But the plan required precise timing and flawless execution. One mistake would trap him in terrain with limited escape routes, surrounded by professional killers who were growing more desperate with each passing hour. Tommy paused at a natural waypoint, a distinctive rock formation that Frank had used as a landmark during their navigation training. From here, he could see multiple routes leading to different types of terrain. He could also see smoke rising from the direction of the hidden camp, suggesting that his hunters were dealing with logistical challenges beyond just finding him. His grandfather's compass pointed steadily toward magnetic north, but Tommy was no longer following simple cardinal directions. He was following the invisible lines of tactical advantage that Frank had taught him to read in landscape features, weather patterns, and the behavior of both predators and prey. The emergency whistle felt heavier against his chest, not because it had changed, but because he was beginning to understand its true purpose. Frank hadn't given him a simple signaling device. He had given him a tool for coordinating complex operations in hostile territory. Tommy was no longer just a lost child waiting for rescue. He was an active participant in his own survival, using skills his grandfather had spent years teaching him for exactly this purpose. And somewhere in the distance, official search aircraft were beginning to appear over the mountain ridges, following search patterns that would eventually converge on this exact area. The decision to return to the Cartel camp was either the smartest thing Tommy had ever done or the stupidest thing he would ever do. He wouldn't know which until it was too late to change his mind. But as he crouched in the shadows at the edge of the concealed operation, watching his hunters spread through the forest in search patterns that were taking them further from their base, Tommy realized he had a window of opportunity that might never come again. His smartphone had been an afterthought when he'd packed for what was supposed to be a simple day hike. Now it represented the difference between his word against theirs and documentation that could bring down an entire criminal organization. The camp was not empty, but it was lightly defended. 2 men remained behind, focused on radio coordination and equipment management rather than perimeter security. They were professionals, but they were operating under the assumption that their primary threat was fleeing through the wilderness, not circling back to gather intelligence. Tommy activated his phone's camera and began documenting everything with systematic thoroughness. The weapons cache, photographed from multiple angles with clear shots of serial numbers and manufacturer markings. The drug processing equipment, captured in detail that would allow law enforcement to understand the scope of the operation. The communication gear, documented in ways that would reveal the sophistication and reach of the criminal network. But the most important photographs were the ones that established context and location. Tommy used landmarks visible in the background to create a photographic record that would allow authorities to find this place. Even if the cartel attempted to relocate their operation, his phone's GPS function was still active, automatically embedding location data in each image. Every photograph would carry coordinates accurate to within a few feet, creating an electronic trail that would lead investigators directly to this hidden camp, regardless of what happened to Tommy himself. The process took longer than he had planned. Professional documentation required patience and attention to detail that conflicted with every survival instinct, screaming at him to flee while he still could. But Tommy forced himself to work methodically, knowing that incomplete evidence might be worse than no evidence at all. The breakthrough came when he found their operational planning materials. A laptop sat open under one of the camouflage shelters, displaying maps and documents that revealed the true scope of what Tommy had stumbled into. This wasn't just a drug processing facility. It was a coordination center for operations spanning multiple states, with connections to criminal networks that reached far beyond these remote mountains. Tommy photographed the screen from multiple angles, capturing route maps, contact lists, financial records, and operational timelines that painted a picture of criminal enterprise operating at levels he had never imagined possible. The dates on some documents suggested that this operation had been running for years, hidden in terrain that most people would never see. But the most chilling discovery was a folder labeled Local Assets that contained detailed profiles of community members, law enforcement personnel, and government officials. The cartel had been systematically infiltrating the local power structure, creating a network of corruption and intimidation that would make their operation nearly invisible to traditional law enforcement efforts. Tommy's hands shook as he photographed page after page of evidence that revealed how thoroughly his community had been compromised. Names he recognized, people his grandparents trusted, officials who were supposed to protect the public, all documented as either willing collaborators or controlled assets in a criminal enterprise that treated human life as expendable. The high sound of approaching footsteps froze his blood. One of the guards was returning to the laptop station, moving with the casual stride of someone checking routine equipment rather than investigating a security breach. Tommy had perhaps 30 seconds before discovery. Not enough time to escape from his current position, but too much time to remain motionless without being spotted. Tommy made a choice that his grandfather would have understood even if Frank wouldn't have approved. Instead of fleeing, he moved deeper into the camp, using the guard's approach as cover to access areas that had been inaccessible during his earlier reconnaissance. The gamble paid off. The guard checked the laptop, made some notes on a clipboard, and returned to his previous position without noticing that the computer had been photographed extensively. But Tommy was now trapped in the heart of the cartel operation, surrounded by evidence of crimes that demanded justice, and criminals who would kill to prevent that justice from being served. His phone showed 47 photographs, each one a potential death sentence if discovered, but also a piece of evidence that could save countless lives if it reached the right authorities. Tommy powered down the device and secured it in the most protected pocket of his backpack, then began planning his escape from the center of a criminal operation that had turned his peaceful mountain wilderness into a battlefield. The irony wasn't lost on him. To gather evidence that could bring safety to his community, he had placed himself in the most dangerous position possible. The baying of tracking dogs shattered the mountain, silence like a chainsaw through crystal. Tommy had been moving for 3 hours since escaping the cartel camp, using every concealment technique his grandfather had taught him, when the sound reached him across the valley. Deep, purposeful barking that spoke of animals bred and trained for one specific task, following human scent trails to their source. The cartel had escalated their search beyond anything Tommy had prepared for. He pressed himself against a granite outcropping, his mind racing through the implications. Dogs changed everything. All of his careful attention to visual concealment, his strategic use of terrain features, his knowledge of human search patterns, became secondary to the simple biological fact that he smelled like prey to animals designed to hunt. The radio chatter he had been monitoring through a scanner app on his phone confirmed his worst fears. The voices were tense now, professional calm, giving way to urgency that bordered on desperation. Mobile 4 to base. Dogs have picked up the trail at the creek crossing. Estimated age of scent at 2 hours, moving northeast toward the ridge system. Copy, Mobile 4. We've got air support standing by and additional ground assets moving to cut off escape routes. This ends today. Tommy looked down at his injured ankle, swollen from a fall he had taken while navigating loose shale in the dark. The pain had been manageable when he was setting his own pace and choosing his own routes. But now, with professional tracking dogs closing the distance and his pursuers coordinating a systematic drive operation, the injury became a potentially fatal liability. The tracking dog's collar had been visible in one of his photographs from the camp, a high-tech piece of equipment that included GPS tracking and health monitoring systems. These weren't casual hunting dogs pressed into service for an emergency search. They were purpose-built assets designed for exactly this kind of operation. Tommy forced himself to think strategically rather than emotionally. Dogs followed scent, but scent could be disrupted, misdirected, or temporarily masked. His grandfather had taught him techniques for avoiding wildlife encounters that might apply to this situation. Though Frank had been thinking about bears and mountain lions rather than trained attack animals, water would disrupt the scent trail, but only temporarily. The dogs would pick up his track again on the far side of any creek or stream. Elevation changes might help, as scent behaved differently at different altitudes and temperature zones. But the most effective technique was one that Tommy had never expected to use outside of wildlife photography: scent masking. The valley below him was home to a large elk herd that used this area as a rutting ground during mating season. The ground was saturated with musk and territorial markings that created an olfactory landscape complex enough to confuse even sophisticated tracking animals. Tommy worked his way down toward the elk grounds, moving as quickly as his injured ankle would allow. Behind him, the baying was getting closer, accompanied now by the voices of handlers coordinating the pursuit. They were confident, professional, and closing ground faster than Tommy could create distance. But confidence could be a weakness if it led to predictable behavior. The elk herd scattered as Tommy approached, but not before he had accomplished his goal. Rolling in the rutting grounds was one of the most disgusting things he had ever done, but it saturated his clothing and skin with scents that would challenge any tracking dog's ability to maintain focus on his specific trail. The technique bought him time, but time alone wouldn't solve his larger problem. The cartel was throwing everything they had at this search, treating his capture as a matter of organizational survival rather than simply eliminating a witness. That suggested his escape window was closing rapidly, and his options for long-term evasion were limited by resources he couldn't match. Tommy needed help, and he needed it soon. His phone showed 3 bars of signal strength, the first reliable connection he had found since leaving the established trail system. The temptation to call his grandfather directly was overwhelming, but Tommy forced himself to think through the tactical implications. Any call could be monitored, traced, or intercepted by people who had demonstrated sophisticated technical capabilities. But there was another option, one that his grandfather had mentioned during their communication training, but never fully explained. Emergency services used specific frequencies and protocols that were harder to monitor or intercept than standard cellular communications. If Tommy could reach the right dispatcher with the right information, he might be able to coordinate his rescue with official search efforts while avoiding the communication vulnerabilities that could lead his hunters directly to rescue teams. The tracking dogs were close enough now that Tommy could hear individual animals working the scent trail, their handlers following behind with equipment that included what sounded like military-grade communication gear. Tommy had one chance to make contact with the outside world before the pursuit reached him. After that, his survival would depend entirely on his ability to outrun professional hunters in terrain that was becoming less familiar with each step he took away from home. The lightning-split tree had been standing when Tommy's grandfather first brought him to these mountains, a massive ponderosa pine that had survived decades of storms before finally meeting its match in a strike that carved it cleanly down the middle. Now it stood like a cathedral, its hollow interior offering shelter that was both sanctuary and trap. Tommy pressed himself into the natural cave formed by the split trunk, listening to the storm build with terrifying intensity above the mountain ridges. What had started as distant thunder was now a full-scale assault of wind, rain and electrical discharge that turned the pursuit into a secondary concern compared to simple survival. The first fat raindrops had begun falling, just as the tracking dogs reached the elk grounds where Tommy had attempted to mask his scent. Within minutes, the drops became a downpour that would wash away scent trails and force even the most determined hunters to seek shelter. But the storm that provided tactical advantage also created immediate physical threats that were potentially deadlier than his human pursuers. Mountain weather in Colorado could change from pleasant hiking conditions to life-threatening scenarios within minutes. Tommy had experienced sudden storms before, always with his grandfather's guidance and proper equipment. Now he was alone, injured and trapped in a natural shelter that put him at risk for the very lightning strikes that had created his hiding place. The split tree groaned in the wind, its damaged structure flexing in ways that suggested it might not survive another major storm. But it was the only shelter available, and hypothermia was becoming a more immediate threat than the possibility of structural collapse. Tommy's wet clothes clung to his body, stealing heat faster than his metabolism could replace it. His grandfather's lessons about cold weather survival echoed in his memory. Stay dry if possible, generate heat through movement if you can't stay dry, and never underestimate how quickly mountain weather can kill. The emergency supplies in Tommy's backpack included a space blanket, emergency food bars, and waterproof matches, but using any of them required light that might reveal his position to hunters who could be sheltering anywhere in the surrounding forest. He was trapped between the immediate threat of exposure and the ongoing danger of discovery. Lightning illuminated the interior of his shelter with stroboscopic intensity, revealing details of the split tree's internal structure that were invisible in normal light. The hollow was larger than Tommy had initially realized, extending deep enough into the trunk to provide protection from wind-driven rain. But each lightning strike reminded him that he was sitting inside what amounted to a natural lightning rod. The storm's intensity exceeded anything Tommy had experienced in 3 summers of mountain exploration. Wind howled through the forest with enough force to uproot smaller trees, and the combination of rain and hail created a percussion symphony that drowned out all other sounds. If his hunters were calling to each other, planning new search strategies, or repositioning for when the storm passed, Tommy had no way of knowing. But the storm also provided opportunities that hadn't existed during clear weather. The lightning strikes, while dangerous to Tommy personally, were also dangerous to anyone else exposed in the forest. Professional hunters or not, the cartel operatives would be forced to seek substantial shelter and suspend their search until conditions improved. That gave Tommy time to address his most pressing survival needs without immediate fear of discovery. Tommy carefully activated a small LED light, shielding it with his body to prevent external visibility while assessing his situation. His ankle was more swollen than before, the joint stiff and painful in ways that would significantly limit his mobility once he left the shelter. His core body temperature was dropping despite his efforts to generate heat through isometric exercises. More concerning was his growing exhaustion. He had been running on adrenaline and determination for hours, but his body was approaching the limits of what 12-year-old physiology could sustain. Sleep was becoming a biological necessity, but sleeping in hostile territory with impaired hearing due to storm noise would be essentially suicidal. Tommy forced himself to eat one of his emergency food bars and drink carefully rationed water from his remaining bottle. The calories would help with heat generation, and maintaining blood sugar levels was crucial for decision-making capability. His grandfather had always emphasized that survival was as much about maintaining mental clarity as physical endurance. The storm showed no signs of diminishing. If anything, the lightning was becoming more frequent and the thunder more immediate. suggesting that the worst of the weather system was still approaching rather than passing. Tommy settled into the deepest part of his shelter, wrapped himself in the space blanket, and began the dangerous process of trying to rest while remaining alert enough to respond to threats. The storm would end eventually, and when it did, his hunters would resume their search with renewed intensity and possibly additional resources. But for now, he was alone in a hollow tree, listening to nature demonstrate its power over human plans and criminal operations alike. The storm had passed by dawn, leaving behind a crystalline morning that revealed the true scope of what Tommy had stumbled into. From his position in the split tree, he could see across valleys that had been invisible during the previous day's chase. What he saw made his blood run cold. The cartel operation wasn't confined to the single hidden camp he had discovered. Thin columns of smoke rose from at least 3 other locations, suggesting a network of facilities spread across terrain that most people would never explore. The detailed operation map he had photographed suddenly made horrifying sense. This wasn't just a drug processing facility. It was a regional headquarters for criminal operations that extended far beyond these mountains, with tentacles reaching into communities, law enforcement agencies, and government offices throughout the area. Tommy pulled out his phone and activated the GPS mapping function, carefully marking the coordinates of each smoke column he could identify. The pattern that emerged revealed careful planning and sophisticated logistics. Each facility was positioned to provide mutual support while maintaining enough distance to prevent discovery of the entire network if one location was compromised. But the most chilling revelation came when Tommy correlated the facility locations with the local assets folder he had photographed. The cartel hadn't just infiltrated his community. They had built their entire operation around exploiting local knowledge, corrupt officials, and intimidated civilians who provided cover for activities that would have been impossible without insider cooperation. Sheriff Deputy Martinez, whose children went to Tommy's school. City Council Member Thompson, who had helped Tommy's grandmother with a zoning issue last year. Even Park Ranger Williams, who worked with Tommy's grandfather and had access to trail closure information and search operation details. All of them were listed in the cartel's files as either willing collaborators or controlled assets. Tommy realized with growing horror that his official search efforts were being monitored, redirected, and potentially sabotaged by people Frank trusted as professional colleagues. Every radio transmission, every search coordinate, every tactical decision was being reported back to the very criminals. Frank was unknowingly helping them evade. The scope of the corruption explained how the cartel had operated, undetected for years in territory that should have been under constant surveillance by Park Service and law enforcement personnel. It also explained why Tommy's hunters had seemed to anticipate official search patterns and coordinate their own operations to avoid contact with legitimate authorities. But understanding the problem also revealed potential solutions. Tommy's photographic evidence wasn't just documentation of drug processing and weapons storage. It was proof of a criminal conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of local government and law enforcement. If he could get that evidence to the right people who weren't listed in the cartel's files, he could bring down the entire network rather than just exposing a single facility. The challenge was identifying who those people might be and reaching them without alerting the compromised officials who were monitoring all standard communication channels. Tommy studied his phone's contact list, thinking through everyone his family knew in law enforcement, government, and emergency services. Most of the names were local, people who worked in the same system that had been infiltrated by cartel operations. But there were a few contacts that might represent clean channels to outside authorities. His mother's cousin worked for the FBI in Denver, handling financial crimes cases that sometimes involved drug money laundering. She would have resources and authority that local officials couldn't match. and her physical distance from the corrupted local network made her an unlikely target for cartel infiltration. More importantly, federal agents had communication systems and protocols that were harder for criminal organizations to monitor or intercept than local emergency services. Tommy composed a text message that included GPS coordinates for all known facility locations, a brief description of what he had discovered, and a promise that he had photographic evidence that would prove everything he was claiming. He attached one of the clearer photographs from the operation map as proof that his claims were based on direct observation rather than speculation. Before sending the message, Tommy took one additional step that his grandfather had taught him during their communication training. He forwarded copies of his most important photographs to multiple cloud storage services, creating backups that would survive even if his phone was discovered and destroyed. The message went out over encrypted federal channels that bypassed local communication networks entirely. Within minutes, Tommy received a response that confirmed his transmission had been received and that federal assets were being mobilized to investigate his claims. But the response also included a warning that chilled him to the bone. Maintain your position if possible. Do not attempt to reach local authorities. We have reason to believe local law enforcement has been compromised. Federal response team en route, but will require several hours to reach your location. Several hours. Tommy had to survive several more hours in territory controlled by people who would kill him without hesitation, while avoiding hunters who knew he had evidence that could destroy their entire operation. And somewhere in the distance, he could hear engines starting up, suggesting that his hunters had resumed their search with the dawn. Hidden beneath layers of clothing and emergency supplies, Tommy's grandfather's military dog tags had remained unnoticed until the moment he needed them most. The metal discs had caught on his shirt while he was adjusting his backpack, and for the first time, Tommy actually read the information stamped into the worn metal. Brennan, Frank J., U.S. Army Special Forces, Vietnam, 1968-1971, Special Forces. His grandfather hadn't just been a park ranger who understood wilderness survival. Frank Brennan was a former Green Beret who had spent 3 years conducting asymmetric warfare operations in terrain that bore striking similarities to these Colorado mountains. Suddenly, 3 summers of seemingly excessive training made perfect sense. Frank hadn't been teaching him hiking skills. He had been passing on combat survival techniques learned in situations where the difference between clever tactics and death was measured in split-second decisions. Tommy fingered the dog tags, understanding for the first time why his grandfather had always seemed to know more about evasion, concealment, and tactical thinking than any civilian park ranger should. Frank had fought outnumbered battles against determined enemies in hostile territory. He had survived by being smarter, more adaptable, and more ruthless than opponents who possessed superior numbers and equipment, and he had been training Tommy to do the same thing. The engines Tommy had heard at dawn were closer now, following search patterns that suggested his hunters had expanded their operation to include systematic coverage of terrain they had previously dismissed as inaccessible. They were learning, adapting their methods to account for a target who possessed capabilities they hadn't initially expected. But Tommy was learning too. Instead of continuing to run, he began to implement techniques that Frank had taught him under the guise of wildlife photography, but which now revealed their true military origins. Establishing observation posts that provided tactical advantage, creating false trails that would misdirect pursuit, setting up scenarios where his hunters' strengths became liabilities. The terrain ahead offered perfect conditions for what his grandfather would have called a channeling operation. A narrow ravine provided the only practical route between Tommy's current position and the areas his hunters needed to search. Anyone following his trail would be forced into that ravine, where they would be vulnerable to observation and potential harassment from elevated positions. Tommy spent an hour preparing the site, using techniques that combined his grandfather's wilderness knowledge with tactical applications he was only now beginning to understand. Loose rocks positioned to create noise when disturbed, false shelters that would draw attention away from actual concealment positions, escape routes that weren't visible from the primary approach, but which provided rapid access to alternative terrain. When the first searcher entered the ravine, Tommy was ready. The man moved with professional competence, checking potential hiding places and maintaining radio contact with his partners. But he was operating under assumptions that didn't account for an opponent who had been trained by someone who understood how professionals thought and moved. Tommy waited until the searcher was committed to the narrow section of the ravine, then began his harassment campaign. A carefully placed rock, thrown from a concealed position, clattered down the far wall of the ravine. The searcher immediately focused his attention in that direction, weapon ready, alerting his partners to potential contact. While the man investigated the false indication, Tommy moved to a different position and repeated the process from another angle. Then another. Each thrown rock created a new potential threat that demanded investigation, forcing the searcher to treat every sound as a possible attack. Within 20 minutes, the professional hunter was jumping at shadows, calling for backup, and making tactical errors that would have been unthinkable during normal operations. Tommy's harassment hadn't caused physical damage, but it had accomplished something more valuable. It had destroyed the searcher's confidence in his own security, and forced him to waste time and resources investigating threats that didn't exist. The radio chatter revealed the larger impact of Tommy's tactics. Other search teams were being redirected to provide support for what appeared to be active resistance rather than simple evasion. Resources were being concentrated in areas where Tommy wasn't actually located, creating gaps in coverage that he could exploit. But the most important result was psychological. His hunters were beginning to respect their 12-year-old target as an active threat rather than simply prey to be tracked down. That respect would make them more cautious, more methodical, and ultimately slower in their pursuit. Tommy's grandfather's dog tags clinked softly against his chest as he prepared to move to his next position. Frank's lessons had covered this scenario in detail, though always presented as theoretical knowledge rather than practical preparation. When you're outnumbered and outgunned, Frank had told him during one of their camping trips, you don't try to win through direct confrontation. You make your opponents afraid of the terrain, afraid of their own shadows, afraid that every step forward might be their last mistake. Tommy was no longer running from professional killers. He was hunting them. The park ranger badge caught the morning sunlight like a beacon of hope. But Tommy's grandfather had taught him that in hostile territory, hope could be as dangerous as despair. The woman wearing the badge moved through the forest with the confident stride of someone who belonged there, her uniform crisp and her equipment professional. She was following standard search patterns, calling Tommy's name in the calm, reassuring voice that Park Service personnel used for lost hiker scenarios. But something was wrong. Tommy observed her from his concealed position, using skills his grandfather had drilled into him during countless wildlife tracking exercises. The woman's uniform was correct, her badge authentic, her procedures textbook perfect, but her eyes were wrong. They moved with the systematic alertness of someone conducting tactical reconnaissance rather than search and rescue operations. She was scanning for threats, not victims. Tommy remained motionless, letting the woman pass within 20 feet of his hiding place without revealing himself. Only after she had moved well beyond visual range did he begin to understand what he had witnessed. The woman wasn't a park ranger looking for a lost child. She was a federal agent using Park Service credentials as cover for an infiltration operation. The realization crystallized when Tommy spotted the equipment she thought he hadn't seen. A tactical radio system far more sophisticated than standard Park Service gear. Body armor concealed beneath her uniform shirt, and a sidearm that belonged in military operations rather than wilderness rescue work. Tommy made a decision that would have made his grandfather proud and terrified at the same time. Instead of continuing to hide, he chose to make contact, but he did it on his terms. Using techniques Frank had taught him for approaching potentially dangerous wildlife without triggering aggressive responses. Tommy activated his emergency whistle, using the specific signal pattern his grandfather had taught him. 2 short blasts, 1 long, repeated 3 times. The pattern that meant extreme danger but cannot reveal position. The woman stopped immediately, her head turning toward the sound with recognition that confirmed Tommy's suspicions. She knew the signal. More importantly, she knew what it meant. She responded with a pattern Tommy didn't recognize, but which sounded official. 3 short blasts, followed by 2 long ones. Then she stood still, letting Tommy choose whether and how to approach. Tommy spent 10 minutes observing her behavior, looking for signs that this might be an elaborate trap. But the woman's positioning, her equipment, and her patient willingness to wait all suggested someone who understood tactical communication and respected the danger that had prompted Tommy's signal. When Tommy finally revealed himself, he did it from an angle and distance that allowed rapid retreat if the situation turned threatening. "You're not a park ranger," he said, staying behind cover that would protect him if she moved aggressively. "You're right," she replied, keeping her hands visible and her voice calm. "I'm Special Agent Sarah Chen, FBI, and you're Tommy Brennan, the boy who's been playing cat and mouse with a cartel operation for the past 18 hours. How do I know you're really FBI?" Agent Chen smiled. "Because you're smart enough to ask, and because your grandfather taught you not to trust anyone without verification." She slowly reached into her pocket and pulled out a badge case, setting it on a rock where Tommy could see it clearly. "My credentials are in there, along with a photograph and federal ID number you can verify by calling the Denver field office." Tommy studied the badge case from his concealed position. The identification looked authentic, but his grandfather had warned him that sophisticated criminal organizations could forge almost any documentation. "What did my grandfather tell you about me?" Tommy asked, testing whether this woman's knowledge came from legitimate sources or cartel intelligence. "He said you knew these mountains better than most adults, that you'd been trained in wilderness survival since you were old enough to walk, and that if anyone could stay alive in hostile territory long enough for help to arrive, it would be you." Agent Chen paused. "He also said you'd be suspicious of anyone claiming to be help, and that I'd need to prove myself before you'd trust me." The specific details convinced Tommy more than any badge could have. His grandfather's assessment of his personality, the references to training that most people wouldn't understand, the acknowledgement that Tommy would require proof rather than accepting claims at face value. "I have evidence," Tommy said, still maintaining his concealed position. "Photographs, GPS coordinates, proof of the whole operation. We know. Your message reached the right people, and we've been moving assets into position since before dawn. But we need to coordinate carefully. The local law enforcement network has been compromised, and we can't risk exposing you to people who might be working for the cartel." Tommy felt the first genuine hope he had experienced since this nightmare began. Professional help had arrived, bringing resources and capabilities that could end the threat permanently, rather than just helping him escape. But Agent Chen's next words reminded him that the danger was far from over. "Tommy, we need to move quickly. Our intelligence suggests the cartel knows federal agents are in the area, and they're accelerating their timeline. They're planning to eliminate all evidence, including witnesses, within the next few hours." The cartel leader's gold medallion caught the afternoon sunlight as he studied the tactical map spread across the hood of his vehicle, its surface gleaming with the malevolent pride of someone who had built power through violence and intimidation. Tommy watched from his elevated position, Agent Chen beside him with binoculars and radio equipment that connected them to federal assets positioned throughout the mountain region. The final confrontation was taking shape with the precision of a military operation, but Tommy understood that his role wasn't finished. His knowledge of local terrain remained crucial to the success of an operation that would determine whether justice prevailed or evil escaped to kill again. "Miguel Vasquez," Agent Chen whispered, identifying the man with the medallion. "Regional Operations Commander for one of the most violent cartels in North America. We've been hunting him for 3 years." Tommy studied the man who'd been coordinating efforts to kill him. Vasquez moved with the confident authority of someone accustomed to absolute power, surrounded by subordinates who obeyed without question and feared the consequences of failure. But there was something else in his behavior, a tension that suggested the pressure of operating outside his normal environment. "He's scared," Tommy observed, recognizing signs his grandfather had taught him to read in both animal and human behavior. Agent Chen nodded. "Federal pressure is forcing him to make decisions faster than he'd prefer. That makes him dangerous, but it also makes him vulnerable to mistakes." The radio in Agent Chen's equipment pack crackled with coordinated communications as federal agents moved into final positions around the cartel operation. Tommy's photographs and GPS coordinates had enabled law enforcement to plan a simultaneous assault on all known facilities, preventing the criminals from escaping to alternative locations or destroying evidence that would convict them. But Vasquez had one final card to play, and Tommy was about to become the center of it. "Base to all units," the cartel leader's voice carried clearly over intercepted radio frequencies. "Subject is traveling with federal agents. New objective is capture alive. The boy has information we need, and his death serves no purpose if we can't recover his evidence." Tommy felt ice flow through his veins. They were no longer hunting him to eliminate a witness. They were hunting him to torture information out of him before killing everyone he cared about. Agent Chen's expression hardened as she processed the same intelligence. "Change of plans. We need to get you out of here before they shift from elimination to capture operations." But Tommy was studying the tactical situation with eyes trained by 3 summers of his grandfather's instruction, seeing possibilities that adult agents might miss. "No, we can use this. Tommy, you're 12 years old. This isn't a game. My grandfather didn't train me to play games." Tommy pointed to terrain features that created natural choke points and observation positions. "They want to capture me alive, which means they have to take risks they wouldn't take if they just wanted me dead. We can use that." Agent Chen looked at him with the reassessment that comes when adults realize they're dealing with capabilities they hadn't expected. "What are you thinking?" Tommy outlined a plan that combined his intimate knowledge of local terrain with federal resources and coordination. Instead of running from the final confrontation, he would create conditions that forced his hunters into tactical positions where federal agents held overwhelming advantage. "It's crazy enough that it might work," Agent Chen admitted after Tommy finished explaining his strategy. "But it puts you in direct danger from people who have no moral constraints about hurting children." "They've been trying to hurt me for 2 days," Tommy replied. "The difference is that now I have help, and I understand what my grandfather was really teaching me." The plan required precise timing and flawless execution. Tommy would reveal himself to Vasquez's forces, appearing to be alone and vulnerable, while actually being protected by federal agents positioned in concealment throughout the area. The cartel's attempt to capture him would lead them into prepared positions where arrest became inevitable, but the plan also required Tommy to trust that adults he had just met could protect him from killers who had demonstrated their willingness to murder anyone who threatened their operation. As federal agents moved into final positions, Tommy checked his grandfather's compass one last time. The needle pointed steadily north, just as it always had. But now Tommy understood that true north wasn't just a direction. It was a moral orientation that had guided his grandfather through combat in Vietnam and was now guiding Tommy through his own battle against evil. Vasquez's medallion glinted in the distance as the cartel leader prepared for what he believed would be the final phase of a successful operation. He had no way of knowing that he was walking into a trap set by a 12-year-old boy who had learned warfare from one of the most dangerous soldiers ever produced. By the United States Army, the hunter was about to become the hunted. The court evidence folder sat on the witness table like a testament to courage, its contents representing the difference between justice served and evil escaped. Tommy had been sitting in the federal courthouse for 3 hours, waiting to testify in proceedings that would determine the fate of Miguel Vasquez and 17 other cartel operatives who had been arrested during the coordinated raids. The folder contained his photographs, GPS coordinates, and documented evidence that had made those arrests possible, but it also contained something more personal, a letter from his grandfather, written after Frank had learned the full scope of what Tommy had endured and accomplished during 2 days that had changed both their lives forever. "I always knew you were special," the letter read, "but I never imagined you would face the kind of test that took me years of military training to handle. You didn't just survive, you prevailed. And you did it by remembering lessons I hoped you would never need to use." The federal prosecutor, a woman named Janet Morrison, who specialized in organized crime cases, had spent hours preparing Tommy for this moment. She had explained how his testimony would be used, what questions he would face, and why his evidence was crucial to convicting criminals who had operated with impunity for years. "The defense attorneys will try to make you seem confused or unreliable," she had warned. "They'll say you're just a child who misunderstood what he saw. But your photographs don't lie, and your GPS coordinates led us to evidence that confirms every detail of your testimony." Tommy understood the weight of responsibility resting on his shoulders. Families throughout the region had been affected by cartel operations that had flourished because of corruption and intimidation. His evidence could free communities from fear while ensuring that killers faced consequences for their crimes. When his name was called, Tommy walked to the witness stand with the same steady confidence his grandfather had taught him to maintain in challenging terrain. The courtroom was filled with federal agents, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and family members of victims whose cases had finally been solved, thanks to evidence discovered in cartel facilities. The prosecutor led Tommy through his testimony methodically, establishing timeline, location, and the circumstances that had led to his discovery of the hidden camp. Each photograph was presented and explained, creating a comprehensive picture of criminal operations that had extended far beyond simple drug trafficking. "Tommy, can you identify the man you observed directing search operations when the cartel was hunting you?" Tommy looked across the courtroom to where Miguel Vasquez sat at the defense table, still wearing the gold medallion that had marked him as a target during the final confrontation. Their eyes met, and Tommy saw something he hadn't expected. Defeat. Not just legal defeat, but the deeper defeat of someone who had built power through fear and discovered that courage could overcome intimidation. "That's him," Tommy said clearly. "Miguel Vasquez. He was coordinating the search teams and giving orders to kill anyone who had seen their operation." The defense attorney tried to challenge Tommy's testimony, suggesting that a 12-year-old couldn't accurately identify people or understand conversations he had overheard. But Tommy's responses were calm, detailed, and supported by photographic evidence that had been verified by multiple federal agencies. "Mr. Brennan, are you certain you understood the gravity of what you were witnessing?" "Yes, sir. I understood that people had been killed and buried, that weapons and drugs were being processed, and that they were planning to kill me and my family to protect their operation. But surely you were frightened, confused, possibly even imagining things." Tommy looked at his grandfather, sitting in the gallery, with the quiet pride of someone who had watched his student become a teacher. "I was frightened, but I wasn't confused. My grandfather taught me to observe carefully and think clearly under pressure. That's what I did. The trial lasted 3 weeks, but Tommy's testimony provided the foundation for convictions that dismantled an entire criminal network. Vasquez received life in prison without parole. His subordinates received sentences ranging from 25 years to life, depending on their level of involvement in violent crimes. But the most satisfying moment came when the prosecutor read the list of law enforcement officers who had been arrested for corruption. Deputy Martinez, Council Member Thompson, even Park Ranger Williams, all faced federal charges that would end their careers and send them to prison for betraying the public trust. As Tommy walked out of the courthouse with his grandparents, Agent Chen approached with news that made the victory complete. The last of the cartel facilities has been dismantled. The evidence you provided led us to operations in 4 states, and we've made over 60 arrests. You didn't just save your own life, Tommy. You saved your entire community. Tommy looked up at his grandfather, seeing pride mixed with something that looked like relief. Frank had trained him for survival, but neither of them had imagined that training would lead to triumph over evil that had seemed invincible. The new trail marker stood at the beginning of what had once been an unmarked path into dangerous territory, its bronze plaque gleaming in the morning sunlight with words that would tell Tommy's story to future generations. Brennan Trail, dedicated to courage in the face of evil and the wisdom passed from grandfather to grandson. Tommy stood beside his grandfather, both of them looking up at the marker that represented more than just recognition of heroism. It represented transformation, the evolution of a frightened boy into a young man who understood that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. 6 months had passed since the trial. 6 months during which Tommy had slowly returned to the mountains that had been both sanctuary and battleground. The nightmares had faded, replaced by dreams of peaceful exploration and the quiet satisfaction that came from knowing he had faced the worst that evil could offer and emerged stronger. "You know," Frank said, his voice carrying the reflective tone that had become more common since learning the full scope of what Tommy had endured. "I spent 3 years in Vietnam thinking I was teaching survival skills to soldiers. I never imagined I'd be teaching them to my grandson for use against criminals in Colorado." Tommy fingered his grandfather's compass, which now hung from his neck with the weight of shared experience rather than simple inheritance. "You taught me more than survival skills. You taught me how to think under pressure, how to read people and terrain, how to turn disadvantages into advantages. Those weren't lessons I wanted you to need, but they were lessons you needed me to have." Frank nodded, understanding that some preparation transcends specific scenarios to address fundamental questions about character and capability. He had trained Tommy for wilderness survival, but the real curriculum had been about maintaining moral clarity and tactical thinking in situations where failure meant death, the trail that bore. Tommy's name now led to areas that had been cleaned and reclaimed by federal agencies, their sinister purpose erased, and their terrain returned to the peaceful wilderness it had been before criminals chose it for concealment. But the trail also led to something more important: confidence that evil could be confronted and overcome by ordinary people who possessed extraordinary courage. Tommy had become something he had never expected, a mentor to other young people who needed to understand that they possessed capabilities they didn't recognize and strength they hadn't tested. The Park Service had created a youth program based on his grandfather's training methods, teaching wilderness skills that emphasized observation, strategic thinking, and moral courage. "The thing about trails," Tommy said, echoing conversations they had shared during countless expeditions, "is that they connect places people need to go. This one connects where I was to where I am now, and where are you now?" Tommy considered the question seriously, looking back down the trail toward areas where he had learned lessons about himself that most people never needed to learn. "I'm someone who knows what he's capable of when everything depends on doing the right thing." Frank smiled with the pride of someone who had watched potential become reality under circumstances he wouldn't have chosen but couldn't regret. Your grandmother wants to know if you're ready for more advanced training. What kind of advanced training? The kind that prepares you to help other people who might find themselves in situations where ordinary preparation isn't enough. Tommy understood that his grandfather was offering him a choice between returning to normal childhood and accepting responsibility for capabilities that could serve purposes beyond personal survival. It wasn't a choice most 12-year-olds would face, but Tommy was no longer a normal 12-year-old. When do we start? Frank's laughter carried across the mountain valley, mixing with wind through pine needles and the distant sound of water flowing over rocks. It was the sound of home, of safety, of family connections that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger. But it was also the sound of preparation beginning for challenges that hadn't yet appeared but which would someday require the same combination of skill, courage, and moral clarity that had carried Tommy through his trial in these mountains. The compass pointed steadily north, just as it always had. But Tommy now understood that true north wasn't just a geographical direction. It was a moral orientation that guided decisions when external landmarks disappeared and internal character became the only reliable navigation tool. Behind them, the new trail marker caught the morning light, telling its story to anyone who cared to read about courage found in unexpected places by people who refused to accept that evil was stronger than good. Ahead of them, unmarked territory waited for exploration by people who understood that blank spaces on maps sometimes held treasures worth discovering and sometimes held dangers worth confronting. Tommy checked his compass and started walking north.